Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am the co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture that brings you tonight's presentation from the Parent Education Series. We are so glad to be here with you tonight and very honored to have our keynote presenter, Dr. Donald Grant. Well, we would not be here tonight without our sponsors, so we are extremely grateful to the Peninsula Healthcare District and the San Mateo Union High School District, again, who are sponsors of tonight's presentation. In partnership with this organization, the Parent Venture. It is a very timely topic tonight, how to keep the lines of communication open with your child or teen. With more than 300 registrants, we know that this is very important for you, parents and caregivers, and we could not be more delighted to have with us tonight, Dr. Donald Grant. Before we get going, and I'll tell you a little bit more about our featured presenter, a few words from Cheryl Fama, the CEO of Peninsula Healthcare District. Cheryl.
Thank you, Charlene. Yes, I'm Cheryl Fama. I also happen to be a nurse and a career-long healthcare professional who currently has the honor of serving as the CEO of the Healthcare District. And on behalf of my Healthcare District team, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight to hear Dr. Grant help us with tips, guidance, and perhaps a fresh perspective on how to handle some of the most uncomfortable and courageous conversations we may be faced with as we raise children, help to raise grandchildren, support students and teachers, serve our community as mental health care providers, and just plain interact with others. When in a conversation on a difficult topic, especially with my kids and grandchildren, I too often find myself immediately focusing on what's the best right thing to say, rather than to fully listen. And then there are times when I do try to fully listen and I let seconds of silence go by to allow for a response, and then my anxiety just gets even worse. So Dr. Grant, I hope you might have some tips for that dilemma. Participants, thank you for attending. Your participation during the Q&A is strongly encouraged. And thank you again to our co-sponsor, the San Mateo County Office of Ed, our wonderful partner, the Parent Venture, for bringing us excellent speakers to address our community. And welcome and thank you, Dr. Grant. We all are looking forward to your presentation. Enjoy, our participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl Fama. We so appreciate having you with us tonight. We know you are a very busy person. So again, participants, everybody who's with us tonight, we're so grateful that you're here. As Cheryl said, as parents, we all want to say the right thing, but we don't always know what it is or how to say it. So hopefully tonight we're going to be hearing from an expert in mental health and communication. This is a webinar format. By now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Zoom, but there's two ways for you all attendees to interact with us. First of all, is the chat button. My co-founder, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links and information in the chat. So do look there. You can ask logistical questions of us, but questions for me and Dr. Grant, we ask that you put in the Q&A box. So chat for logistics and resource links, questions in the Q&A. If you do put a question in the chat, we may gently remind you to put that question into the Q&A box. So Dr. Grant will be talking with us for about 30-35 minutes. And then we really want to open it up to you, the audience, for your questions. So feel free, whether during the presentation or during the Q&A period, we really want to hear from you. There will be a very short survey at the very end. We hope that you will take a minute or so to fill that in for us. And lastly, this event will be video recorded and available soon on our video library. With more than 50,000 views, the library has become a really important resource for parents, caregivers, and educators. All right, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's featured presenter. Dr. Donald Grant is a trusted thought partner to teams and organizations across the globe. He is the executive director of Mindful Training Solutions, a boutique training and consulting firm, and the former founding executive director of the Center for Community and Social Impact at Pacific Oaks College. He holds a doctoral degree in clinical psychology, a bachelor's degree in biology, and a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner certificate. Dr. Grant is also an international workshop facilitator, a film and TV consultant, and the published author of A Moon for Us All, a family narrative for young readers and their families, and Black Men, Intergenerational Trauma and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations, published in 2019. Please join me in a really warm welcome for our friend, Dr. Donald Grant. Take it away, Donald.
Thank you so much, Charlene, for that warm introduction. Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here. So great to hear about all the sponsors and everyone involved in making this conversation happen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can dive right in, because I really want us to have the opportunity to ensure that we get into the Q&A period section of this work. And so, as was discussed, we are looking at communication with young people, with children, with youth, and what that means and what that looks like. And so keeping the lines of communication open with children is where we land today, but we're going to open up that aperture just a little bit wider and a little bit broader. We understand that everybody comes to discussions with different levels of pre-existing understanding, and my goal is to get us all on the same page so that when we go into this discussion about the tougher stuff, we're able to really get it and understand it. So first of all, what is the meaning of communication? And it's been defined in several different ways, but one way is that we know it's a process of meaningful interaction among human beings. More specifically, it is the process by which meanings are perceived and understandings are reached among human beings. It's an exchange of facts, ideas, opinions, or emotions by two or more persons. Now, the definition of communication is important, but what's equally, if not more important than the definition of communication, is the nature of communication. And it's whatever one wants to say, it must be clearly understood. Otherwise, the very purpose of communication is defeated. I'll reiterate that. Whatever one wants to say must be clearly understood. Otherwise, the purpose is eliminated. So when we talk about what makes effective communication is dependent on the outcome. And there are not lots of definitions that are dependent upon the outcome. Communication is one of them. Here are two more. So I want to give you an example so that you understand the real nature of what we're talking about. Again, not all words are defined by the outcome. And so when you think about communication and things like punishment and reinforcement, they are. So punishment is adding something or removing something aimed at stopping a response from happening again. So what's the definition of punishment? Is when a response or a behavior decreases based on what you did. Now, reinforcement is adding or removing something aimed at ensuring that a response will happen again. So if you add or take something away and it decreases the response rate, and you thought it was reinforcement, it was actually a punishment. Same with communication. If you think you're communicating, but the other person doesn't get what you're saying, or you don't get what they're saying, communication didn't occur. When we think about punishment and reinforcement, we understand there's positive, negative on both sides. And I have this little image here to help us understand. So at the top here, top left-hand corner, we have Homer Simpson, and with positive reinforcement, that's something you get that's beneficial, that makes you want to do it again. Remember, a reinforcement only happens if it increases behavior. On the bottom right, we see R with a minus sign. That's a negative reinforcement. That means I've taken away something that was bad to help decrease the behavior. That's relief. Whew. Top right-hand corner, negative punishment. I'm taking away something that you like in order to reduce a behavior. Oh. Positive punishment. I'm adding something to decrease the behavior. Again, we're reiterating. There are only a few words in the English language that are dependent upon the outcome for their definition. Punishment, reinforcement, and communication is one of them. The reason why communication is dependent upon its outcome for its definition is because it does these things. It helps to remove misunderstandings. It helps to create clarity. It helps to articulate thoughts, and it explains feelings. When we talk about communicating with children and communicating with youth, one of the things that they look for, and one of the things that we need to help youth gain access to, is increased control of their environment. Part of that comes through communication. We understand that kids come along with so many thoughts, ideas, and feelings that they don't have experience yet with managing or mitigating. A part of our job as adults is to help to kind of massage that information into spaces that they feel safe enough to discuss and safe enough to engage. Now, what I'm going to challenge you with is this thought of safety. Safety is great, but communication is too large to simply rely on safety. What we have to begin doing is relying on bravery, and that's something different. We can create safe spaces for kids, but are we creating brave spaces for kids? By understanding the nature of communication and understanding the purposes of communication, we're able to create those brave spaces where children will begin and young people will begin to come to us voluntarily for things. Now, I understand tweens and teens are just as they are. They're at the developmental stage where some things will just not be natural for them to do. And we do have to curate those environments. But the more we focus on our understanding of these things, the more we can engage our youth with them. So first, again, removing misunderstanding, creating clarity, it helps to articulate thoughts and explains feelings. Now remember, explaining feelings is different than naming feelings. We want youth and adults to not just be able to name their feeling, but to explain it. And what I mean by explain it, it's not just indicating that one is sad or one is anxious, but it's the ability to explain what that feels like, what that looks like for this individual, what it makes them anticipate, what it makes them fear. That requires a bit of bravery, but it also requires modeling. Are the adults inside are the adults inside the ecosystems of the children, are they themselves modeling this behavior? Are we as adults showing vulnerability, not just naming feelings, but explaining them? Not just saying and discussing sadness or excitement, but are you able to articulate what that feels like for you? Because you want to model that articulation for the children. Now, what communication can be? It can be written, it can be oral, it can be formal, it can be informal, it can be interpersonal, or it can be interpersonal or intrapersonal. We want our children to gain access to all of these things. There's going to be a time and space where your kid has something really, really, really heavy to talk about, and they may not feel initially comfortable expressing it. We'll talk a little bit later about development and the importance of building the bridge between written communication and oral communication. We want young people to know that there are all these different ways that they can communicate information to us. And in fact, if a young person doesn't feel comfortable articulating something, because remember, that comes along with a level of anxiety, a level of fear, sometimes depending on the gravity of the discussion, that they may just need to write it out and share it with you. And you may need to write them back and share it with them. And hopefully that will lead to other types of communication, like perhaps oral communication, in a way that you're able to have those discussions. But we want to be open to each of them and see the value in all of these forms of communication. Kids don't always want to sit down and talk, especially teenagers. And many of us adults talk for too long. We want to sit down and have a 45-minute conversation with a kid, and they're just like, I can't do this. Yet we perseverate, forgetting that oftentimes in that long-winded conversation, we're mitigating our own stuff, and it's not about our kid or the kid that we're working with. We got to pay attention to what we bring to the table. In addition to being written or oral, communication can be formal or informal. There are times where we have to have very formal conversations with young people. There's a recent video coming out of the state of Texas with some young people using some serious racial slurs. That requires a formal conversation with formal consequences. And sometimes that's what we have to do as well. Formal communication is not just reserved for the work or presentation space. Sometimes inside of our households, inside of our classrooms, we need formal communication. As equally as understanding when it's time to have formal conversation, we also have to understand when it's time to have informal conversation. If the only conversation you have with your child or a child that you're caring for, if the only conversation you have with them around homework is formal conversation, you're never going to be able to engage with them on their interests and their hobbies. Understanding, having the EQ or the emotional intelligence to do both as adults is really critical. Now, helping kids understand the difference, or the value, not the difference, in interpersonal communication and intrapersonal communication is critical. We oftentimes talk to kids about how to engage with other children. We start very early. Oh, you have to share, you have to engage and be nice and be kind and be conciliatory. Yet we rarely give children intrapersonal communication skills. How do they communicate with themselves? How do we help them navigate situations that create anxiety and that bring about fears if we're not giving them tools to communicate intrapersonally in those moments where we are not available? For some, that intrapersonal communication is helping kids gain self-healing tools, help kids gain empowerment tools, help kids learn how to stand up in situations whereby they would normally be a bystander. Those intrapersonal communication skills are critical. And you just have to think, how do you speak to your own self in times of anxiety and stress? What is it that you need to give yourself in order to meet a challenge? And you know you've developed those intrapersonal skills, those intrapersonal communication skills, excuse me. If we want to be able to have these conversations with kids, we got to make sure we're seeing the totality of the framework and all that it includes. Communication is written, oral, formal or informal, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. Now, we understand that there are several reasons why we communicate with the world and several reasons why we communicate with one another, but these reasons also apply to how and why we communicate with our youth. Now, tangibly, there are several reasons why we communicate. There are several purposes to communication. First one being information. Kids desire structure, no matter what they say. They're interested in structure. All developmentalists demonstrate that that's true. They benefit from being informed on what is happening in their homes and schools. Sometimes we surprise kids with things, or we lay things up on them and we expect them just to pivot very easily and not be dysregulated. Information sharing shows that we respect them. Now, some of us may have grown up during a time where kids were to be seen and not heard. We know now that that was developmentally dangerous for the ways in which children were raised back then. I know everybody's like, oh, well, I came out fine. That's cool, that's okay. Yet we want to do better. And we want to do more than just fine. We want our kids to thrive. And with that comes along with us creating these environments. Another thing that comes along with communication, another purpose of this, is coordination. The goals of families can be accomplished more effectively when everybody is on the same page. And this coordination that comes from communication helps to ease some of the things associated with all the movements that you all have. Now, when you have these really tough conversations, having tackled all these things, it really makes those tough conversations a little bit easier. Learning. We learn through communication. Communication is instructive. It's instructive to ideas, beliefs, perceptions, and value systems. How are you communicating to ensure that your youth, the young people who you are responsible for supporting the development of, how are you ensuring that they're getting all these tangible benefits of effective communication? Remember, we began with understanding why communication is effective, and that's because of the outcome. If you don't understand them and they don't understand you, communication wasn't effective. The psychological purposes of communication are many. I just have 3 right here that I thought might be most valuable for this discussion. We could have a whole hour-long discussion just based on the psychological purposes of communication. But the one thing that we'll start with is it helps to decrease anxiety around change and inconsistency. Now, many of you may remember 100 years ago where we had these things called Franklin Covey day planners. They were about this big and they listed everything that could happen. They had tabs everywhere and it was one of those genius products you could ever get. I can remember when I got my first Franklin Covey planner for Christmas, probably almost 30 years ago. And you think about how that set up your space to decrease inconsistencies. What we know is that children, no matter whether they are neurotypical or neurodiverse, are dysregulated as a result of inconsistencies. They already have a million things going on in their world. If we could engage in effective communication to minimize some of those inconsistencies, and more importantly, mitigate some of the anxieties associated with those inconsistencies, we'd be on our road to opening up the space for almost any type of communication we needed to have. Communication, bi-directional communication specifically, it makes kids feel seen and understood and heard and valued. When we talk about the mental well-being of children and their ability to be brave enough to bring to you some of the most important and difficult topics that will happen throughout their adolescence and childhood, making sure that they feel understood and valued is critical. We can no longer operate from a space whereby children don't have value. We've seen this across history, particularly in America, and how that plays out. It is of critical importance that we continue to engage children in a way that make them feel valued and seen and understood. Finally, for the psychological components, and again, as I stated, we could do a whole hour-long presentation simply on the psychological purposes of good and effective communication. But finally, for this particular purpose, kids feel empowered when adults communicate with them authentically. So many young people are walking around feeling disempowered, and we understand even more dangerously what that looks like when individuals reach adolescence and how that changes and that level of feeling undervalued or devalued or disempowered. We need now more than ever the ability to empower children. If we want them to engage in pro-social behaviors that lead to significant transitions in what we're seeing in the world right now, they need to be empowered. They need to be able to stand up, whether alone or with a group of people, for what they believe in, even if it's not what you believe in. They need to be able to do that, and we need to give them the tools to be able to do that. We start that through modeling in the home and through providing them with all of these key tools and significant activities. Now, when you are moving into communicating with your young people, when you already understand what communication is, you've decided what the purpose of your communication is going to be, you've decided what type of communication or what types of communication you plan to use, there are certain things that you have to pay attention to as you move into these situations. Now, some of the foundations are giving your full attention. Many of us talk to our children like this. What impact does that have on you as an adult when you are engaged in that way? When we don't provide our full attention, we create a hugely negative influence on how our children learn to communicate, but more importantly, what we're communicating to them about them. Giving full attention is a critical effort in ensuring that our children gain communication skills and that you build trust with them so that they will bring you these things. The next important point is don't talk at your children. Encourage bi-directional communication. Again, many of us grew up in situations and scenarios where we weren't encouraged to share our thoughts. We weren't encouraged to share our feelings. But we don't want to do that with our children. We want to make sure that they get opportunities for bi-directional communication. This is what creates leaders. This is what creates pro-social behaviors. This is what creates opportunities for children to be upstanders and not bystanders. We have to pay attention to body language, both yours and theirs. What does your engagement look like? What does their engagement look like? How do you navigate those engagement styles? And what do you need to pay attention to as you navigate them? The words are not the only part of communication that are important. Lastly, here is probably one of the most challenging ones to pay attention to, and that's asking specifically about feelings and not things. We don't just want to say, did you win the soccer game? We want to ask about what the experience of the soccer game was, how they experienced the test that they either passed or didn't pass. What that does is it provides an opportunity to bring mindfulness into it and help children understand that they can engage in conversations and not necessarily feel judged about the outcomes of the situation. And that opens up their space to talk with you in a mindful way, to say, wow, this adult in my life, they just don't care about the outcome. They actually care about my experience. They actually care about the fact that I did this thing, but as I approached, I was anxious, I was nervous, I felt this, I felt that, and this is how I navigated it. One of the ways in which we do that is making sure that our children and the people who we care for also see us expressing authenticity within our emotions. Too many times we try to hide from our children when we are frustrated, when we're angry, when we're worried. Well, what that does is it creates a cadence for children to feel like they don't have the right, the space, or the ability to be authentic to their own experience. There's a lot of things right now that are making a lot of kids very nervous. Unfortunately, many of us adults are not providing good models for them to express those emotions and feelings in a pro-social appropriate way. We are modeling them for them. We are modeling for them, however, ways to hold in emotions, ways to ignore emotions, ways to not pay attention to emotions. That's what we don't want to do. We want to move our children into a space whereby we are providing them with the openness to engage. Now, one of the last things I want to say before we move to Q&A, and I have one more slide after this one, is don't go directly into problem-solving mode. This can be a division, a divisive way of communication. Well, here's what you should do, young man, or here's what you should do. We want to be thought partners to young people. Now, of course, there are spaces where we are guiding them and supporting their development according to all of the experience and all the information we have as adults. There are certain pitfalls that we know how to avoid. And we can still translate and transmit that information to them. But when we dive into problem-solving mode immediately with young people and with our children and specifically, we create a framework where we let them know both implicitly and explicitly, you don't have the capacity to solve this problem on your own. You need my help. Now, that may very well be true. They may need our help. But if our primary disposition, our most top of mind reflective thought to respond to our young people is problem solving mode, we still an opportunity from them to grow. And we still an opportunity from ourselves to see what wonderful young people we have in our households or our schools or churches, wherever it may be. We can guide and support good problem solving, appropriate problem solving. Yet we don't want to start there. Now, sometimes a kid will come to you and say, hey, I need help resolving this problem. Of course, then we can dive right into a collective thought partnership on solving the problem, but we don't want to start there. Where I wanted to end today was I wanted to make sure that people understood that there are also developmental qualities to the ways in which we engage in open communication with our young folk. We can have any kind of conversation with any aged kid, but we have to pay attention developmentally to what's important at those stages. I was doing some diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting with a small private school here in Southern California in Los Angeles. And there was a child in the elementary school who was engaged, who was moving into gender affirmation activities with her parents in order to affirm who she was as a transgender child. The fourth grade teachers felt like there was no way possible to discuss this concept with children of that age. I went in and helped them understand that developmentally, there are ways to discuss anything with any child. Oftentimes, our fear of engaging in that discussion is based on our own stuff, things that we have not yet reconciled. Those teachers and instructors understand and learn about different animals in nature whose genders may oscillate over the lifespan, like seahorses, and to not necessarily compare those of the transgender community with seahorses, but to help them understand that there is a developmentally appropriate way to talk about these things. We have to just be able and ready to go there and understand that these discussions are important. And so some of the ways in which we look at developmental stages for young people across the lifespan, we begin looking at preschoolers and the communication ways we do this. Now, please note, and I meant to say this at the top of the presentation, the things that I'm speaking about are aimed primarily at children who are not members of the neurodiversity community. Those things that we're saying are all foundationally connected to all children, yet there may be some additional tools and resources that one needs to add when working with children from the neurodiversity community. So I didn't mention that off the top, but I do want you to know that everything we're talking about is appropriate for all children. We may just have to do them in a different way in order to make it such that kids with different abilities are able to gain access and build strength as a result of the tools that we bring to the table. And so looking at these developmental stages, when we look at preschoolers, we have to identify some of the most important foundational pieces of their development to define how we will approach communication and communication styles. So one of the things, we want to increase connections between verbal and written communication. And I mentioned this earlier. This is a time where little kids are just now learning to read and write and learn letters and things like that. We want them to know that this written communication can serve just as great and wonderfully as expressing yourself verbally, because we want them to build up the strength, the power, and the ability to be able to write their feelings down. What I found with young people, in many cases, journaling has been one of the most wonderful ways in which they have been able to move past trauma or help with an important decision. And if we build this bridge between written and verbal communication very early on, it's a foundation that kids won't lose. We want to engage in fantasy and pretend play to expand the communication abilities of preschoolers. When we talk about asking about feelings, as you see with this last bullet point here, one of the ways we get children, particularly at the preschool age, to talk about their feelings is through one of their favorite worlds, and that's the fantasy or pretend world. How can we get them to articulate the feelings of a teddy bear or a doll or a robot or a car, whatever it may be? Those are ways in which we want to engage preschoolers to set the foundation to build trusting communication across their entire childhood. With our school-age children, those ages 6 to 12, and I know that's a huge developmental space, those 6 years right there have so many things baked and embedded into them. What we want to do at that stage is make sure that we're keeping up with the activities of those children and their friends and the things they like and they dislike, because we want to use those things in conversation. We want to ask about the friends and use their names and remember their names. That shows kids at this stage of development that we're interested in who they are, not just as our kids, not just as our students, but as people. We want them to know that we value them as people, and understanding what's important to them is really a big part of that. I mentioned this part earlier, be a thought partner in goal setting and problem solving. You want to empower them. Explain corrective communication and constructive feedback. Very early on in many people's parenting journeys, or in our childhood journeys, we've heard the words, because I said so. I've tried my best not to be the because I said so dad, but I've said it a couple times. But what I do know is what research tells us is that communicating the reasons why we give feedback is so important to you. It's so important to their development, and it's so important to being able to engage them in a way that when they become teenagers, they trust you and they understand your perspective. And they're more willing and able to come to you in those really tough times. Finally, with our adolescents, again, a very, very, very heavily changing time those 6 years represent. Remember, adolescents are going through significant social and physical changes. Most of us don't remember our adolescence, but there was a lot happening during those years. And I think sometimes adults minimize that time in a young person's life because we think and reflect upon all of the knowledge and experience we have. We forget to take that into account when we're working and dealing with teenagers. Hold them accountable and provide them with support. Finally, be okay with their individualization and understand that that individualization, it may in fact include ideas that are different than your own. When we take all of these things into account and we think about the important conversations we want to have with young people, these are the foundational frameworks that help us really engage and really learn from the young people who we want to engage with, but give them space to openly communicate with us. All right, Charlene, I know we have some questions that have come into the chat box. I know we have some that may have been previously submitted. And so I want to make sure that we give time to honor those questions from our participants today.
Well, thank you, Donald, for all that wonderful advice and discussion. You made so many important points about listening and how communication empowers kids and how letting them know what's going to happen next decreases their uncertainty. These are all such important things. I have a new grandchild and I'm going to tell my son and his wife, remember, even if she's 8 weeks old, tell her what you're doing and why you're doing it, right?
Listen, Charlene, I had a whole nother piece of that developmental stage about talking to babies that is so critical, but I didn't want to go over time. But yes, some advocates even speak to the concept of asking babies permission. And, you know, it's really interesting to look at what that science is bringing about.
I really love that. All right. Well, we have, as you say, wonderful questions coming in. We've had some that came in earlier and here tonight. So let's just dive right in. So many great questions. All right, here we go. Parent asks, my son is 15 years old and he really does not like to open up to me about how he's feeling in certain situations. How do I guide him to talk to me about how he's feeling? Oops, I can't hear you.
I should be able to know how to do this by now. I was on mute. Such an important question, Charlene, and thanks to the parent who asked that question. Remember, most questions that parents are asking here, there's somebody else in this room of 120 people who also has the same question. And so be brave enough to ask the questions so that we can make sure we dig in and get what everybody needs. Again, as I stated before about adolescents, they are going through a developmental stage that is already very challenging. There's some great books that talk about why boys don't talk. And it's a really common theme that a lot of parents deal with and engage with. One of the things we want to do is we want to be able to engage our boys in spaces where we are engaging in discussion during an activity. Research shows that oftentimes brings in the opportunity to have greater discussions about feelings and things like that. We want to model for young boys about feelings. We want to have young boys see models of other men engaging in emotive activities. There was a slide that I saw on Instagram earlier today that was just 5 different images of celebrity men crying. And I just felt that was so valuable to show that we have to dismantle all the messages of this kind of toxic masculinity that limit an already challenging opportunity for boys to talk and engage. We got all the noise that adds on to that. We want to eliminate that noise and then engage in activities sometimes that really help promote the discussion. You know, even if you're playing a game of Scrabble, like you can intentionally spell words out with feelings and just engage in the conversation, right? There are so many ways to do it, but we got to blend it in, we got to model it, and we got to understand that that is going to be a challenging one because naturally research is telling us that that's a hard one to engage.
All right. Are you a fan of movement with boys, shooting hoops, taking a walk?
1,000%. I'm actually a fan of that with boys and girls, Charlene. When I was a therapist with LA County Department of Mental Health, I had one client who had started taking, she was 16 and she had started taking some antipsychotic drugs for her bipolar disorder. We did her therapy walking around the park. The drugs had started to make her gain weight and she wanted to lose weight and she wanted to keep our therapy sessions. I said, well, let's do it walking. And it really opened up. And don't forget, walking and aerobic exercise also releases cortisols, which is our stress hormone. When we release those cortisols from our body, it literally reduces our stress and anxiety. So why not double dip on that one and help reduce the stress and anxiety while engaging in activity that brings about good communication?
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, here's a question. If you could solve this one, we would have fixed everything. And you actually modeled this earlier. Parent asks, do you have any practical suggestions on how to encourage teens from getting off their phones and be interested in communicating with their family?
Oh, well, that one I don't think I have an answer to. Now, I do know that there are some households that limit phone time in certain spaces and certain aspects of their daily lives. I have a 12-year-old son. There are no phones allowed at his school during the school day. They can have them first thing in the morning and then right in the afternoon. Even on their buses to the sports activities, they're not allowed to have their phones out. And so I think that setting structured rules like that in the beginning are valuable. I also think that young people's phones should be charged outside of their bedrooms because we help to build them to build comfort being absent their phone. But again, we also have to understand that culturally, this generation is more tied to that technology than we are. So I do think sometimes adults have to think twice about some of the restrictions, but we do have to still put some of the restrictions on. I don't think it's unreasonable to say no cell phones at the dinner table, no cell phones during family meetings, so on and so forth. But adults have to create that. A 12-year-old is not going to just come and talk to you because they want to talk to you.
And as you modeled, you know, we do too much of this, looking at the phone and talking. You really do have to put your devices down, parents.
We have to do that. If we want our kids to do it, we have to put our devices down. We have to turn the TV off.
Right. All easier said than done.
Right.
Okay. Here is a very honest and vulnerable question, Donald. Parent asks, my daughter is 20 years old, and I realize now that she's smoking marijuana daily or occasionally. I know she's a young adult, but how could I let her know that she really should quit smoking, but not make her feel too distant from me?
I think that's a wonderful question. I think that when we pay attention, again, like I mentioned earlier about different generations and different ideologies of people, anytime you combust and set something on fire and place it into your lungs, it's dangerous, period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So I think as a parent, we get to make those statements and help kids and young people understand the health consequences of those things. Now, here's the thing I want to challenge parents with is and again, my son is 12 years old, and so I'm not yet facing that particular dilemma. However, one of the things that we also have to pay attention to are the generational definitions of certain things. Now, I'm not encouraging anybody to encourage their children into drug use or alcohol use, but I will say that sometimes some of our approach is based on the negative stigmas that we have. Again, we can still share the message with our youth and our teenagers that this is not okay. Your brain is still developing and you're negatively impacting it by that. Please note, our brains continue to develop until age 25. And so the introduction of any sort of substance can negatively impact that. So that's one point that we can make. The other thing is that we want to help young people understand that the introduction of substance use at that early stage can definitely create a physiological addiction and a psychological addiction that can diminish their own ability to solve problems, their own ability to self-regulate, their own ability to communicate effectively with other people. And so even though for this parent, I think it would be very challenging for you to have a conversation with your 20-year-old daughter to get her to completely 100% abstain from marijuana use. And that probably shouldn't be your goal, given the fact that that person is 21. But what you want to do is you want to help them differentiate between recreational use, abuse, addiction, and self-medication. We got a lot of young people at that age demographic engaging in marijuana use for self-medication. And when that's happening, we want those youth to understand that they are eliminating their ability to create and develop important skills in lieu of that substance use. And so those are some of the things, but I do want parents to know, that for children and young people who are older, we got to pay attention a little bit more to the nuances of this. We just can't walk into a situation saying, you can't ever smoke marijuana. And they're like, I'm 20 years old. And you need to come up with a better discussion point for me on that one. And I think that's the dialogue. I don't want you to not have the skills and the tools that you need to navigate the world. And when you do that, you're taking away an opportunity to gain a skill or to gain a tool. And I think that's different than you're at a birthday party and you eat a brownie. And again, I know there are parents who will disagree with me, but I'm speaking about a 20-year-old woman and a mom who's afraid that the use is too much. What I'm saying is that natural decision or the best answer may not be completely abstaining, but for some situations, it may be required that complete abstinence is the only success story in that situation. And so there's so many ways to cut it, but I do want parents to pay attention to what they bring to the table surrounding these things so that they can truly understand the purpose of their communication. And that's one of our first slides, is what is the purpose of why you're communicating?
All right, thank you, Donald. Parents, there are also videos on our video library from Dr. Anna Lemke and Dr. Tawhid Zaman on addiction and marijuana. Check those out. The best thing you can do as a parent is be informed. Have your facts right. Yeah. Okay, Donald, these are wonderful questions, tough questions, wonderful questions. Here we go. How do you build trust and openness with a teenager, a young adult, when they don't even want to communicate with their parents?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And again, that's why I kind of ended with the developmental stages of this space, whereby there are so many things that we need to pay attention to. It is a natural part of adolescence to individuate. And sometimes a part of that individuation is associated with a less than optimal level of communication with parents and caregivers. One of the most important things that I find we should do as parents and caregivers is to make sure that our young person, our child, has another trusted adult somewhere in our orbit. We can't minimize the fact that developmentally, your child is not going to want to talk to you all the time about everything. That is just a given. Psychology, sociology, everybody has understood that point. So we have to just kind of move forward beyond that and say, okay, I'm going to do my best and I'm going to set up these guardrails. That means having a trusted thought partner in your circle, whether it's an uncle or an aunt or a coach, oftentimes somebody a little bit younger than the parent, but older than the child who's an adult. We want them to have a thought partner that's not us in those situations. Now, the other thing is we want to explore why it might be, besides developmental stages, that our kid doesn't want to engage with us in these conversations. What type of mood are we carrying around the house? What type of verbal and nonverbal messages are we giving them about their ability to approach us? What are we doing on our approach to make it less desirable to even have a conversation with us? Some of us walk into the room like Sasquatch trying to have a conversation with a teenager, and then we're mad when the teen doesn't want to talk to us. Well, did you see what your approach was like? Did you see how you opened up the discussion? Would you have opened up the discussion like that with one of your coworkers or one of your peers? Those are the things that we need to think about. We've too long objectified children. Now we need to humanize them to make sure that we're engaging with them in a way that brings about what we want to bring about.
Well, that's really great advice, Donald. Okay, here's an allied question.
Well, Charlene, I just gotta pause for a second. This group today has some really, really tough questions. These are some really, really good questions. They are forcing me to think very deeply into my vault.
Well, we have more. We have more. This is a good one. All right, here we go. I feel like I'm on American Idol. Parent says, I have an 11-year-old girl, already feels like I'm parenting a preteen. I find myself getting very critical of her negative behavior when it surfaces, and I fear it's costing me a strong positive bond with her. How can I reset myself to be better for her?
Oh, what a lovely question. What a lovely question. I'm hoping all the parents heard that. What can I do to reset myself for her? The first step is you've already taken the first step. You've already understood that there are things that adults can do for a reset. So many adults approach this area of space unwilling to think about how they can be changed or change themselves in the engagement process. I feel like a lot of parents minimize our own childhood experiences and how they play out in our parenting. We don't always see those things come up. And more often than not, people want to talk about, the traumas in these experiences. It doesn't even have to be traumatic. All of ourselves comes into these spaces. So when we think about reset, I think one of the first things to pay attention to is that an 11-year-old today is a different 11-year-old than an 11-year-old in 1988.
Yeah.
A totally different 11-year-old. And I don't know why I picked 19, maybe because I was around 11 in 1988. Maybe that's why I picked it. It's totally different than an 11-year-old in 1988. We know that physiologically, psychologically, the whole 9 yards. We know that research is telling us that young girls are beginning menstruation now at ages 9 and 10. And when most of us were in school, that wasn't happening until 12, 13, 11, maybe, but now it's happening earlier. We understand that physiologically and psychologically, young people are being exposed to things that we weren't exposed to. So one thing we have to do also is stop vilifying the change in dynamics of these generations and own the fact that children gain exposure way faster than we ever did because of all the mediums which they're coming in. And so we have to own the fact that we must engage with them and meet them where they are. I was the type of kid, my dad never let me saw a PG-13 movie until I had turned 13. He was very much stickler for that. And so now my son is seeing rated R movies at 12, and then they're violent, not sex and drugs, but those things are happening. How do we recheck ourselves and go there? Some of that is exposing ourselves to some things. Now, I'm not recommending this for any children. However, there's a show on Showtime called Euphoria that has just been literally blowing my mind in thinking that this is the current teenage experience. And although it's not the teenage experience for the vast majority of teenagers, I think it's a good level set for some parents to say, oh, wow, my mind was still in 1988 and now I need to do better. I don't think we've done a good job at exposing ourselves to the developmental qualities of this current chronos system. And so I'd encourage that parent to really dig in and ask the daughter things, get into her head, about what she's interested in, and understand that her 11-year-old, even though she feels like a teen to you, she's probably 11, just where an 11-year-old should be. It just feels accelerated because of what we had at 11 and what we did at 11. Reset in that way to say, this is a real 11 for today. It's kind of like when you go and get a pair of new shoes, you know you wear a size 11, but in this particular cut of shoes, you actually need a 12 or you actually need a 10. Paying attention to that is really important.
Well, I know I was probably still playing with dolls at 11.
Oh,
All
yeah.
right. So many great questions, everyone. I wish we had time to answer them all, but let's take two more, Donald, okay? I think this is a great one. Everybody's wondering. Parent asks, sometimes finding the words to address an issue or talk to your child thoughtfully and empathetically is difficult. Do you have any links or resources or role-playing games that we can look at and practice?
I love role plays, first of all, Charlene. It's one of my most favorite ways to help people train. And so I feel like really developing out different vignettes to practice are a really great idea for partners to practice in discussions with kids, or even for parents to engage with the kids. You know, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's so many great conversational resources that they're like little cards that you pull out of a box and you just ask the question and everybody gets to answer it and go around and talk about it. I remember former President Barack Obama talking about at their dinner table, they would do the thorns and roses game every day at the table. Everybody would go around, tell the roses of their day and the thorns of their day. And it was just something that kids got into the nature of doing, and it becomes a natural part of how your family works. And so I do think that there are loads of tools out there. We just got to do it. Me and my dad would play backgammon a couple times a week, and through backgammon we would have conversations. And so there's so many ways to engage and so many activities to do. Movies I find to be amazing ways to do that. And that movie Coda, CODA, about the deaf and hard of hearing community, that opens up the door for so many different conversations. It's a recent film, and it's culturally appropriate for young people and teens.
Absolutely. So parents, you can have your child pick the TV show and then you watch together. You
Yes.
may learn something, right?
Yes, and don't reject their choice, adults. You may be in shock and awe, but don't reject their choice.
All right. Here's a question. This is on my list too. Every parent's favorite question. What do you do when you ask your kid a question like, how was your day? And they don't want to answer.
Well, here's this funny. Today, this is exactly what I got. My question was, how was your day? How was school? How was track? Those are the three questions I asked my 12-year-old when he walked in the door.
Yeah.
Guess what answer I got for each of them? Good, good, and good.
And so you were done. He was done.
It was, well, no, it would have been done, but I walked into his room and I literally said, give me a hug and I need more than good.
Okay.
Give me a hug and I need more than good, because I needed more than just good, good, and good. Now, one of the first tips we have to do is stop asking such closed-ended questions. How was your day leaves the room open for single word answers. Yeah. What parents have to do is engage in questioning that goes beyond a single. So instead of how was school or how was your day? Oh, tell me about your math test today. Or I know you guys just finished reading this book in humanities. How was that discussion?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Again, if you ask a question that has a one-syllable answer, that's what you're going to get.
That's what you're going to get. That is what you're going to get. You're going to get that every single time. And if you want anybody who is over the age of 10 to answer with more than one word, don't ask them a one-word question.
Right.
You're going to get a one-word answer.
Exactly. All right. Since we're solving all the problems of the world, Donald, we'll throw this one in here.
Let's do it.
How do you communicate transitions? And that's a great word, parent. How do you communicate transitions when your child will not turn off the video games?
When we're talking about transitions and helping kids do that, we got to start setting boundaries. And I can't say that I'm perfect at this as a dad. We got big projects going on and we end up letting the kids play on the video game or watch TV a little bit longer than we wanted to, because we got something that we're trying to get done really quickly. Like, they're occupied, they're good, I still got work to do, we're working from home, all these different things, right? We want to help kids understand transitions by creating boundaries. A lot of us are not good at saying, video games go off at 7 p.m. Well, I don't have anything else to do. Well, we'll find something to do. We have to be very deliberate, and it's not easy, because what it does is it requires us to do something. Now we have to go and play Scrabble. Now we have to go and play backgammon. Now we have to get in the swimming pool. Now we have to help with homework. But these are things that we unequivocally have to do. If we're asking for the kids to be tooled up on these things, it's going to require stuff for us to do. And so if we want to increase understanding of those transitions, a part of that is, turn the game off at this time, or here's what needs to happen now, or, let's come all together. And maybe your kid has a chore to do the dishes or take the garbage out. Maybe you sit in the kitchen with them while they do the dishes. You don't have to help them with doing the dishes, but you can talk to them while they do it, as opposed to them sitting there with their earbuds, and they don't even watch TV on a real TV anymore. They're just always like on their phones and like tablets and stuff. So I judge them for that. I'm like, with your good eyesight, how dare you sit there and watch that? But we have to really open up the aperture to be deliberate about it. And I think that's the process, Charlene, is we have to get deliberate about these things. We can no longer leave it to happenstance.
That's right. And I think, Donald, you said, we can use communication, parents, to warn our kids about what's coming, help them make those transitions. Don't walk in when they're in the middle of leveling up on a game and say, turn it off, because then you're going to get some real negative stuff.
Oh, immediately, 10 minutes left, or they know it's going off at 9, and be flexible. Like if you said the game has to go off at 9 o'clock and they're just like, I'm at level 35 of Fortnite and I can't stop right now, it's okay to say 7 minutes. That's okay.
Yeah. So Donald, you've given us so much great advice tonight. Do you have any kind of final words for us?
I think that when we talk about this topic of engaging our young people in authentic communication, and I think I've shared this across several of our discussions, adults have to manage their own stuff. We got to figure out what we're bringing to the table, what we're asking our children to do, and why we're asking for it. Sometimes you'll find that through your parenting, you are attempting to remedy your childhood. And I want people to know that that approach will always end in a negative space. Now, you may still end up doing the exact same thing that you decided to do. Just make sure you're doing it with the purpose of their positive outcomes in mind and not your own.
Great advice. Dr. Donald Grant, thank you for all your wisdom tonight. It has been wonderful. Thank you to Peninsula Healthcare District and San Mateo Union High School District for your sponsorship of this great event. Parents, again, thank you for joining us tonight. The video will be available soon. You will get an email with the link when it posts. We work with the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula, so it takes them a few days. But again, thank you, Donald. It was lovely tonight. Thank you, everyone who joined us, for all your wonderful questions. Wish we could have gotten to all of them. We promise we'll do this again soon. So take care, everybody. Good night, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.